I've listened carefully to what my friend Mark Dreyfus has said, and I agree with him that we should always aim to achieve bipartisan support for Israel. However, the Jewish community, both in Australia and beyond, has got to judge for itself the decisions and the actions of our governments and our leaders and make its own decision, make its own judgment as to whether that support is strong enough, whether it's unequivocal enough, whether it sends the right messages. Now, let me just say this. Israel's action in intercepting that flotilla was about sovereignty and national security. Israel has the right, but above all the duty, to protect the safety of its citizens. That is the fundamental duty of every state, of every government, everywhere in the world, at any time in human history. So Israel has a fundamental duty to ensure, insofar as it can, that no more munitions, no more missiles find their way into Gaza, because Israel knows Gaza is run by a terrorist organisation whose avowed mission is the destruction of Israel. So Israel has a duty to protect its borders and to prevent munitions finding their way into Gaza. So, if that being said, it is plain enough that Israel had every right to intercept the flotilla and to divert the ships to Ashdod. So the criticism then is not of the strategic issue, protecting Israel's sovereignty and safety, but of the tactical issue of how the raid on the ship was mounted. And here we have to be very careful, particularly here so far away in Australia, in such a safe country, in a country which does not face an existential threat every day, every hour of its life. We have to be very careful, not trying to be the political equivalents of what the Americans would call Monday morning quarterbacks, trying to rerun the exercise. The message we have to send as an Australian government, as an Australian parliament, as an Australian people, that knows that in the battle against international terrorism, we are in that battle with Israel as our ally. And Israel is fighting the same enemies in the same battle and stands in the front rank, in the front trench. And Israel deserves and should command our solid support. We don't have, I agree with Mark, it's absurd to say you can't be critical of Israel, we can't have a debate about different tactics and different approaches. All of those are legitimate and they occur everywhere. Inside the Jewish community, inside Israel, in the general community around the world. But the fundamental message that Israel, a nation so besieged, so threatened, with this unique existential threat, with enemies that want to wipe it off the face of the earth, Israel needs to hear from Australia an unequivocal message of solidarity and support. Thank you very much.
I can tell you from my time as Director of Middle East that the biggest concern that our Middle East partners or people that we have dealing with was the threat from Iran, their threat of acquiring nuclear weapons and the threat they pose to peace and stability in the region, because Iran does have a hegemonic objective nationally and internationally to assume a position of leadership for radical Islam in the world. So it is a mutual threat that we face. And this exercise in relation to this Gaza flotilla was not an academic exercise for Israel. It was only last November 2009 when the MV Frankop was intercepted and it was revealed there were 320 tonnes of major weapons and ammunition and supplies in that vessel. And of course, the Korean aid has been mentioned in the same context in terms of attempts to smuggle weapons into the Gaza, but there is a daily effort to smuggle weapons in, particularly exploiting Sudan and Yemen by land through Egypt, etc. And that was in fact the purpose and the point behind the targeted assassination of al-Mabou in Dubai. Now very close engagement with Israel through our maritime capability, acquiring the Heron UAVs, many other forms of individual combat gear and equipment, and most recently we've secured a $350 million contract with Elbit, who I was pleased to visit when I was in Israel, who are now going to be providing us with a very complex but effective battlefield management system. And those types of cooperation continue and deepen all the time. Plassem, who I also visited, who make wonderful force protection technology for vehicles, is engaged as a bidder with Thales in the protected mobility vehicle that we are seeking to also develop. So this relationship is continuing to deepen. We know, and I've had personal experience, that some of these Islamist NGOs or relief organisations are fronts for nastier, more evil purposes. And I have confronted them several times in the field. Even in Somalia, our Australian troops were fired on several times by the so-called Islamic Relief Organisation, and one of my soldiers was shot through the shoulder, and we're of course engaged in full contact and combat with the Islamic Relief Organisation. And they've been involved in places like Bosnia as well as fronts for activities, and that includes the IHH, which were the Turkish Islamist organisation involved in the Marmara, who have been well recorded through various intelligence agencies, and including the Turkish authorities, as having been involved in support for terrorist organisations, probably most recently involved in support for the attempted bombing in Los Angeles airport. So this is a front organisation for terrorism. We should acknowledge that. We should continue to make sure that the public understands this.
You have not heard one word, no one here has heard a word from the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Minister, from any minister in the Australian government, and nor will you, of criticism of the targeted killing of the Hamas operative. And that is because the Australian government believes that Israel is required in its security interests to undertake that kind of action from time to time. And perhaps I could add to that, Australian troops serving now in Afghanistan are involved in just the same kind of action in the combat against the Taliban, except that generally speaking the killings are carried out by the American forces. So do not confuse the two. One is the protection of Australia's security interests, and the other is the targeted killing, of which the Australian government has expressed no criticism whatsoever.